In this video, I'm comparing 3 popular student grade or entry-level gouache brands. My goal with this video is to show you some close-ups and give you some insights about the opacity and consistency of the gouache so that you can make an informed decision when it's time for you to buy your first set. I've also posted a lot of this information on my blog with individual reviews, as well as updated my gouache database with all sorts of useful information. And I've also posted a separate video reviewing and comparing 8 of the most popular professional grade gouaches. So there's lots for you to watch and to choose from. Arteza has been one of the most requested brands that I try and review. Arteza only offers their gouache in curated sets, so they kind of have themes. I chose the earth tone set because it looked interesting, but you can get bigger sets or sets with basic colors in them as well. I was actually shocked at how creamy the gouache seemed as soon as it came out of the tube. It wasn't runny, there was no binder separation, it just looked like really nice gouache. Arteza is the second cheapest gouache on my list next to the Miya HIMI. It's less than $1 per tube, and the company did confirm that it's vegan friendly, so there's no animal byproducts. Nearly every tube in the set contains multiple pigments, but most of the tubes contain the same pigments, so the colors are more harmonized across the set. The majority of these colors contain at least a little bit of PW6, which is titanium white, which is probably why this set seemed so opaque. I have seen reviews online of some of the other colors in the bigger sets that seem slightly more transparent, but the earth tone set blew me away with the opacity. I was very pleasantly surprised by how well this gouache performed. To me, the opacity of the gouache is one of the most important things next to consistency. And speaking of consistency, my first impression while doing these swatches was that it was so creamy and just glides across the paper really easily. Actually, compared to all the brands I tested, and even some of the professional ones, this paint moved so smoothly across the paper. Part 2 of my swatching test is to do a little mixing chart. So after those basic swatch cards are done, I just have fun with the colors. I try to see how much variety I can mix with each set. Now, given the fact that the majority of these colors contain the same pigments, the overall reach of these colors are limited. In fact, one of the first things I notice is that there are way too many browns and tan tones in this set. There's only one blue, and it's really dull. I get the fact that they're going for a very muted, earthy set of colors, but for landscapes, blue is probably the most important color. I felt that they could have at least included one more blue with a slightly more powerful tinting strength. One thing I noticed right away is that this gouache dries really quickly. I think it's probably the fastest drying gouache I've ever used. So although it's very creamy and easy to paint with, you really will have to watch out for that. You could probably get around that by using a stay wet palette while you paint, and definitely be diligent with a little spray bottle and keep it moist as you go. It wasn't long before my paint piles were basically rock hard and crumbling off my palette. In all of the brands I tested, I decided to use as little water as possible because I really wanted to test the opacity and see how far I could get the paint to reach across the page. When I say that, I mean how far does one brush stroke go? I've seen some reviews of this gouache where the painter calls it sticky. I've used some sticky gouaches in the past, so I kind of had a good feel for how to adjust things to be able to paint with it. I think this could present a challenge to a beginner who hasn't quite gotten a handle on water control yet, because that's one of the really tricky things about gouache, to use just the right amount of water to get the paint to flow but not lose the opacity. So I don't really know how to perfectly describe this gouache. It's like, can a gouache be both creamy and dry at the same time? Weird. So in conclusion, I guess I'll sum this up to say that it's a very good set of gouache for the really low price. The colors are limiting, and you'll definitely create stylized paintings because of that. But if you're just wanting to dip your toes into gouache and try it for the first time, or, spend a lot less on your first gouache set, I think that Arteza is the best out of all of the cheap brands I tried. A lot of people call this jelly gouache because it reminds them of Jello cups or jelly cups. I don't really know why actually, but this brand or this type of gouache is growing in popularity, and I guess maybe part of it is that the set looks really cute. I mean, let's be honest, it does. Once it's all set up, it's pretty attractive. And I do get quite a lot of comments and requests about this gouache, so I was both hesitant and excited to try it. The 30 milliliter cups are twice as big as the typical 15 milliliter tubes you get in other brands. And it's the cheapest of all the brands I could find. So you do technically get a lot for your money, but as you'll see in my review, you get what you pay for. No, that's not to say you can't create a painting with this gouache, and I'll show you that, of course, that's possible. But there are definitely some limitations with this set, and I'll do my best to give a fair comparison and show you what I mean. The first thing I noticed when I opened all of these little cups is that every single one of them had pretty severe binder separation, so I had to stir every single one very thoroughly. I've also noticed since then, it's been a few weeks since I've opened it, the binder separation is happening again. So I believe that this is just an ongoing thing you'll have to deal with. If you let it sit for too long, you do have to mix them quite a lot before you use them. The second thing I noticed is that they smell absolutely horrible. It was like a combination of chemicals and pond water, like stagnant water, just really awful. And I am sensitive to smells and chemicals, maybe more than the average person, but it was so bad that I had to turn my fan on and blow the air away from myself while I swatched and painted with these. I did email Miya Arts, which is the company that makes this gouache, to ask what's in their binder and if it's vegan friendly, and they said it's a petroleum-based binder and it is vegan friendly. They don't use heavy metals or anything, so that means that like their cadmium and cobalt colors aren't truly cadmium and cobalts. They're like hue versions of them, which is cheaper for them to make it that way. But they don't provide any information about pigment names or what's actually in them, and I've noticed online there are a lot of sources showing that the colors aren't light fast, so these are pretty much only suitable for sketchbook work or if you scan your art and sell prints. Let's talk consistency. The first thing I noticed is how creamy they seem straight out of the tube, or cup. When I was doing these little swatches, I could get the paint to easily flow and layer up, and it seemed pretty opaque. Of course, some colors are more transparent than others, and that's natural, and it even happens in all of the professional brands. But the majority of these were perfectly fine as swatches. But when I started mixing the colors, things changed quite drastically. Suddenly the paint seemed extremely transparent and a bit gummy, a bit gooey. There were maybe 4 colors in the whole set that seemed inherently opaque. Otherwise, I had to add quite a lot of white to get them to be opaque. In terms of color, it seemed a bit challenging to mix some clean colors, meaning the reds that they offer in addition to the particular yellows. Overall, I felt that the mixes were a little bit more muddy or dirty than what I'm used to with pure primary colors. This was especially true with mixing purples. For the test painting, I decided to use a limited palette, and I scooped it out and put it on my own tray because I actually found that I really don't like the texture of the Miya mixing tray. It just instantly stains, and the paint seems harder to mix and get a nice even consistency. It seemed like the second the paint touches the paper, any moisture in there is just immediately sucked out. and I experienced a very severe brush drag, meaning it was hard to get the paint to flow across the paper without adding a lot of water, which of course would dilute it and make it even more transparent than it already is. So that was a pretty big challenge. Filling in larger, flat areas of color seemed nearly impossible. So whereas the Arteza felt really dry to paint with, but I could still get it to flow, the Miya HIMI has a lot more sticky consistency. I'm purposefully not cutting out this part of the painting because I'm trying to show you how long it took me just to paint the sky and the water. And again, I'm not trying to dilute the gouache too much because I'm trying to kind of get a fair comparison between all of the different consistencies. As soon as you dilute gouache, it's basically watercolor. So in order to really compare all the brands, I'm using them at their full opacity. I would not be surprised at all if this paint had dextrin in it because it was so sticky and really hard to move. And there's nothing wrong with dextrin. It's just an additive used for various reasons, and even some of the more professional brands use it. But there's a point where they may add too much of it, and then it really resists dragging and flowing across the paper. Painting with these two brands of beginner gouache, the Arteza and the Miya HIMI, was very eye-opening. And although you get a lot of paint for your money, once again, you do get what you pay for. The Arteza definitely beats the Miya HIMI in terms of opacity and consistency. In addition, being able to close the tubes is far superior to a set that is always open. Even though you can close the lid, it spills inside the lid and it'll eventually dry out. Furthermore, you can't take any of these individual cups out with you on a day trip. So when I go out to paint, sometimes I'll throw a couple tubes of gouache in my bag and I'm good to go. But with this set, you have to lug around over 2 pounds of paint. That's just way too much for a day trip. So in conclusion, yeah, you can paint with this and, you get a lot for your money, a lot of colors, a lot of paint. But to me, it's just not worth it, especially when the Arteza is very fairly priced and performs much better. Next, we're going to jump into a slightly higher price tier, but another brand that is made for beginners that I've been getting more and more questions about. The next set is Caran D'ache, which I'm sure is pronounced differently. And once again, I was only able to buy this in a set. It took multiple emails to get the pigment numbers from the company. I'm not sure why they don't post those online. And they did confirm that their binder is made of dextrin. So overall, their paints are considered vegan friendly. There was a fair bit of binder separation, meaning the binder and the pigment was not thoroughly mixed and it would come out separately. This is pretty typical of paint, and it even happens in the professional brands. And as you saw, it happens a lot in the Miya HIMI. It's just something you have to deal with. You just mix it thoroughly before you start painting. At around $5 per tube, I was expecting a big jump in quality. Not only were they quite transparent, which is not necessarily the gouache's fault. A lot of times certain pigments are far more transparent than others, and it could have just been the fact that Caran D'ache chose very transparent choices of pigments for this particular set. But the fact that Arteza was able to create a gouache that was so much more opaque than this for a way lower price says a lot. In addition, the consistency of this gouache was very gummy. This angle shows the gumminess and transparency a little bit more. The only way I could achieve fully opaque color was to add white. Therefore, I was naturally desaturating the color. So yes, you can still paint with this, but if you want opaque color, you have to add a lot of white. So if they chose to use pigments that are more transparent in this mixing set, that already makes life a little more difficult. Again, you can add white to every single mixture and get that more opaque version of the color, even though it's desaturated, and you can still make it work. But then there's still the problem with the consistency. It feels like the paint doesn't glide smoothly, it gums up the brush quickly, and it was really difficult to get nice even color. It felt like most of my mixes were streaky. If you look at the scans on my blog post about this brand, it's really obvious. So to make it more opaque, you can add white, which of course means you're going to go through a lot of white. In my case, I had to refill my white pile 6 times, which is way more than usual. If you insist on buying this brand, this set, definitely get an extra tube of white. It almost seemed like the gummy consistency of the paint made it resist mixing. So mixing 2 colors together, and especially with white, which is typically very strong, very overpowering, it can easily take over a mix. It took extra mixing time to make it a nice, even color. I let the paint dry out on the palette and checked it the next day, and it was interesting that it didn't get super crumbly as much as the Arteza did. It kind of stuck together a little bit more. However, when I added water to reconstitute it, it just really didn't go well. It just stayed kind of chunky and gummy, and it was even more transparent than before. And yes, I did compare this to the dried pan set, which I had lying around from years ago. And it was basically the same thing, kind of gummy and chunky and a bit grainy and extremely transparent. So I didn't even bother making a painting with these ones, but I did swatch them and try to show you some close-ups. To be honest, I barely classify this as gouache. It felt like watercolor that had some kind of strange binder. And again, you can make it more opaque if you add white or really try to dig out the color, but it was just a bad experience. Much like the Miya HIMI Gouache, the Caran D'ache has a lot of brush drag, meaning it's a challenge to get the paint to flow smoothly over the paper without adding a ton of water. And once again, the colors are very transparent, so I had to add a lot of white to layer up my landscape. I find it a bit annoying that they charge so much for both the tubes and the pan sets, considering that there are so many better alternatives out there for a much cheaper price. Which brings me to the conclusion of this brand comparison. Yes, I can create a painting with anything you put in front of me. It won't be without struggle, but it's doable. But I prefer to enjoy the process. And out of these 3 beginner brands, Arteza outperforms the rest. It's more opaque, it's creamier, it has a better flow, and yes, it does dry out quickly, but you can easily get around that. And I would much rather have that than a very gummy or grainy and super transparent consistency. And while you do technically get more paint for your money with the Miya HIMI sets and some of the other basic entry-level sets, you really get what you pay for in terms of quality. So there you have it. And this is probably the last time I'll use entry-level gouache. If you'd like to learn more about professional artist gouache, I have another big brand comparison video with 8 brands of the most popular professional gouache. In addition, I have a ton of other gouache videos on my channel. Just check out my playlists. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you soon. Take care.